So the thesis statement is one of the most important parts of your paper. A paper with a good thesis statement, it just is a way to start out strong and to help you to remain focused and cohesive throughout. And if a paper doesn't have a strong thesis statement, then it's really hard to kind of keep together and keep focused, both as the writer and as the reader. So you always want to have a good thesis so that the reader understands what the paper is going to be about. Now, if you've already watched the title presentation, then you're like, well, the title shows you. Well, the title shows you a very small snippet of understanding of the paper's general topic, but the thesis is really this main statement that says, here is what the whole focus is going to be. And it's going to help you connect everything because you can kind of go back to it. So for any of you who are more math-minded than English-minded, and you remember way back in math when you were taught to check your work in a problem, well, a thesis is kind of a way that can help you check your work in writing, because you can look at each paragraph you write after your intro, highlight on your own what you believe is your thesis, and then with each paragraph say, did I address this point in this paragraph? Is this paragraph connecting to the thesis? And if it's not, then if it's just one paragraph, you need to work on that one paragraph. But if it's a few paragraphs, then the first thing you want to consider is that really your thesis in the first place? Was another sentence in your intro a thesis? Do you need to make a different thesis? Because you might not need to change those paragraphs. You might just need to change what you thought the focus of the paper was going to be. And then for the strong introduction, it's really the focal point. It's what people look for in an intro, especially in a shorter essay. When you start to write longer essays or essays in higher level classes, sometimes you have a thesis that's implied, so you don't have a direct thesis statement, or sometimes you save the thesis statement for later in an essay. There's even, the Rogerian argument where you are kind of looking at a couple different sides of a topic and then towards the end saying which one you think has more validity. And sometimes there's essays where you kind of build on questions and don't really come up with a thesis until the end. But for the items you'll be writing in this class, you'll want to have a thesis very clear and present in your intro paragraph. A thesis is not a title, an announcement of subject, and a statement of absolute fact. So let's look at a couple examples of what a thesis is not. So The Fad of Divorce, that's a title, and even with what I talked about in titles, it's a decent title, but it could be better. So maybe it's the first part of a title or the second part of a title, what comes after the colon, but it's definitely not a thesis statement. My subject is the incompetence of Professor X. So this is what we call an announcement. When you say my subject is, or this paper is about, or this essay will cover. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Miss G, I've read example essays before in classes that teachers gave us, and the people who wrote them said, this essay will discuss. And you're right. And I'll admit it's actually not wrong, but it's not a good habit to get into, because there are certain styles of writing, certain types of papers where an announcement of subject works, but it's not always the case. And so if you fall into the habit of doing that, then you start to think that that's appropriate for any type of writing, and it just isn't. So I want you to kind of break that habit now, and then later on, once you get comfortable with different types of writing, after this class, you can start to play around with, again, maybe doing those announcement of subject type thesis statements. You do those a lot in more kind of technical writing, in scientific writing, things of that nature. So again, things we wouldn't really be doing in this particular class. Stephen King is the author of The Shining. That's a fact. You are not writing a Wikipedia page. You are not writing an informative essay. So nobody should have a thesis statement that's an absolute fact, with the exception of, you can make the argument in your narrative essay, what your thesis is going to be an absolute fact, because it's a statement about your life, something that happened to you or is happening to you. But even then, if you're saying that something inspired you to do something else, if that's part of your thesis statement, you know, this is, if you've read the assignment sheet, you'll understand this reference. Baking lemon bread with my Aunt Trudy taught me the importance of such and such, whatever that would be. That could be your thesis statement. And in a way, it seems like a fact to you, but you're still kind of, you have to convince the audience and make that argument. It's not like we can go in a book and find research that says that this is actually a fact. So we're talking about things that you can look up anywhere and say, oh yes, this is true, this is a fact. Those are not thesis statements. A good thesis should be one that's restricted and unified and specific. So we're going to actually look at some examples of ones that aren't any of those to give you a better example of what you should be doing. So something that is too broad, the world is a terrible mess. Well, my goodness, sure, but if you wrote a paper where you defended that thesis, you're going to have a tome. You're not going to have a paper. You're going to have something that's thousands of pages, because you're going to have to go into every single thing that is making the world a terrible mess. What you want to do is restrict it and focus on one thing that you think is making the world a terrible mess. Trade barriers contribute to international tensions. That's one thing. I could have said almost a million things here, but the point is to show you the difference between something that's super broad and something that's much more restricted and specific. Not unified. Detective stories are not a high form of literature, but people have always been fascinated by them, and many fine writers have experimented with them. That's kind of like if you and I are sitting in Starbucks and we're like, oh, hey, do you ever read detective stories? Oh, yeah, I read detective stories, but, you know, and it's kind of like what happens, what you would say after that, but, you know, it's very conversational and all over the place. So instead, you want to create a more unified thesis and say something like detective stories appeal to the basic human desire for thrills. Now it's very to the point, it's very clear, a lot more cohesive than that first one. And then a vague one, my parents are wonderful, wonderful people. Well, this is a problem for a few reasons. First of all, congratulations, super glad you have wonderful parents, yay for you. But what do you mean by wonderful? I mean, I know people who think that ice cream is wonderful. I like ice cream. I definitely enjoy it. I don't often turn it down, but I wouldn't say I think it's wonderful. So when you say wonderful, that's a word that, even though you can look it up in the dictionary, we often kind of bring our own interpretations to it. And so if you say my parents are wonderful people, this is kind of leaving the audience with, hey, you make up your own interpretation of what that means, and you don't want that for a thesis. So instead, give us a really specific example of how your parents are wonderful people and make that your thesis. Everything my parents do is based on their loving concern for the welfare of the family. Then your paper can highlight a couple of the things that your parents do that you feel shows their loving concern that is for the welfare of the family. When you revise a thesis, make sure it's in the right place. So that's one thing to check. Is it in the intro? A lot of times people like to have it as the last sentence of their intro, especially when you're first starting out with college writing and there's so many new things you're learning. That seems to be a very safe and comfortable, familiar place for people to put the thesis statement. So you might want to do that, but you definitely want it in your intro somewhere. And then, like I mentioned before, you want to read the paper and make sure that your original thesis still holds. You want to check your work. When revising an essay, make sure that each topic sentence connects to the thesis. So when you write a paragraph, every paragraph, the first sentence should reflect what the content of that paragraph is. So it's really easy if every first sentence of a paragraph actually does reflect the content of it, then you can read your topic sentences and see if those connect to your thesis in some way. And then You can do a refutation. This is something that will you do more in like an argument, refutation, counter argument, counterpoint. Those are different names for just showing a different side to your argument. So a lot of times you'll give a few points and then you'll say, you know, here's a counter to the ideas. That's great. Counter arguments do have their place, their purpose, but you can't just throw a counter argument paragraph into your paper. You want to make sure that you have a topic sentence that uses really good transitional words to make it very clear that your next paragraph or two are going to be a paragraph or two that show a different side. Otherwise, if you don't have those proper transitional words and topic sentences, then it seems like all of a sudden you switch sides mid-paper and it confuses the audience. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. But really, thanks for listening, and I hope that you either have learned a little bit more about thesis statements, or for those of you who kind of, you know them, you've used them, you've heard about them, you just needed a little refresher. Hopefully this helped.